Well, thank you for coming here, and thank you for everybody who's listening online. I appreciate your time. Tonight's presentation is sponsored by the Friends of Pinehawk, and this slide is our advertisement for what the Friends of Pinehawk is. It's an organization, volunteers that put itself together several years ago after a major archaeological discovery in Acton when they were putting in their waste treatment plant. It happened to be a area of Native American settlement between 4,000 and 7,000 years old. We've sponsored events mostly in the October timeframe for Massachusetts Archaeology Month for the several years since then. The group has grown quite large, and if you wish to become a member of our mailing list, if you're not already, you can see the websites for those of you at home at the bottom, and you're welcome to email us and come on in. So let me introduce our speaker tonight, Peter Anick. Peter has a couple hats he wears. During the day, he's a researcher in computational linguistics at Brandeis. Avocationally, however, he's an archaeologist with several kinds of interests. He's been a longtime member of NERA, the New England Antiquities Research Group. He's a past editor of their journal, and he's the coordinator for the NERA Massachusetts state events. He's currently also the vice president of the American Rock Art Research Association, and pieces of that will be filtering into tonight's presentation. So without ado, Peter, please come on board. Thank you very much.
Great, thank you, Greg, and thanks everybody for coming here either live or virtually. It is good to be back with the Friends of Pinehawk, and in fact, it's good to be back in Massachusetts, because 2 weeks ago, you would have found me here on this mountaintop in southeast Spain chasing wild horses. Now, in this particular case, it took me about 2 hours and 3 hours of hiking uphill, but eventually did find one. And as you can see, this was no ordinary horse. This one had been wandering the hills for about 25,000 years. Now, archaeologists refer to an image carved into stone as a petroglyph, to contrast with an image painted on stone, which is known as a pictograph. And both petroglyphs and pictographs are types of rock art, which is a catchy but perhaps misleading term, since we have no idea whether the creator's purpose was to produce art, and most likely it wasn't. Now, I am in the habit of looking very closely at petroglyphs. And if we look more closely at this one, we can see that the outline here was created by hundreds of tiny dents. I hope you can see that, right? So these dents would have been struck by a sharp round point of a hard hammerstone, and the precision of the outline suggests that it was produced by what's called indirect percussion. That is, the hammerstone was placed in position and then struck by some heavy object to produce the dent. In direct percussion, the hammerstone is used by itself like a hammer. Now again, looking closely, we can see that actually, let's go back to this one. We can see that the dent marks around the head are shallower than the rest of the body. The ears and the mane may have been produced with a different hammerstone, with a broader, more chisel-like edge. Back to the full horse, we can also see a narrow, subtle sort of narrowing at around the of the width of the line to separate the mane from the back of the horse. And then there are the legs, or maybe the lack of legs. Shortened or missing legs are very common for Ice Age art. However, thanks to angled light, we can see that there's a natural deformation of the rock where the horse's flank and back leg would be. And using natural features of a rock to enhance an image is known as incorporation. And it's possible that the natural resemblance to a leg led to the use of this rock in the first place. So, though we might be reluctant to think of this image as art in the modern sense, there are a lot of artistic qualities, even in this simple outline. So rock art is not doodling. It's time-consuming, it's purposeful work, likely carried out by special members of the community. It usually reflects cultural norms associated with a specific time and place. And the choice of subject matter and the nuances of how that subject matter is portrayed will often define a style. Now, as with other artifacts, such as stone tools and ceramics, archaeologists are not only interested in the artifact itself, but also its context, where it is found, what other things are found with it, can we assign a date or a culture, what function did it serve, what can it tell us about the people who made it. And unfortunately, because rock art is generally found above the ground, most of the traditional tools of archaeology, which rely on stratified soil levels, layers cannot be applied. Now, rock art, of course, is found around the world and is particularly abundant where there are good natural canvases. So, for example, in the Southwest United States, petroglyphs are often found on smooth boulders with a desert varnish, and this creates a strong color contrast when the surface is pecked away. The tough, rough granite and gneiss boulders that comprise so much of New England's landscape are unfortunately extremely poor canvases. They're difficult to carve into. They have little or no color contrast. And yet we do find examples of indigenous petroglyphs here in New England, typically near rivers or bays where stone surfaces and bedrock have been worn smooth. So some of you may be familiar with Dighton Rock, which sits at the mouth of the Taunton River. Though quite worn, you can clearly make out these deeply carved abstract patterns. There's round faces on oddly shaped bodies and what appears to be a deer with its body divided into different sections. Along Narragansett Bay in Rhode Island, there's a group of carved anthropomorphs in active poses, perhaps portraying a dance or ceremony. In Vermont, there's the Bellows Falls collection of carved faces. And if you'd like to learn more about these sites, I refer you to a previous talk that I gave to the Friends of Pinehawk, which is currently viewable on YouTube, entitled Rock Art of New England. What I'd like to do today is describe some new research on a site in Maine. So Maine happens to have two of the most extensive petroglyph sites in New England, a collection of panels at various coastal locations around Machias Bay, and the focus of this talk, which is a single ledge jutting into the Kennebec River near Emden. So the earliest description of the Emden site that I could find comes from an 1881 Gazetteer of Maine, which gives it the name Indian Ledge. And it reads, "The ledge inclines to the water at an angle of about 40 degrees, and the portion marked is about 12 feet long by 3 to 6 feet wide. Some of the figures are as follows: 2 warriors, 2 squaws, dog and deer, bow and arrows, a canoe with Indians, 2 crosses, a small wigwam, and a larger house of English form, etc. A Penobscot Indian to whom these were shown acknowledged that he could not read the inscription, but said that there was one member of his tribe who could." That was back in 1881. So some of the images mentioned in this account can be identified in this old photo, in which the petroglyphs have been chalked for better visibility. Now, we now know that chalking is harmful to petroglyphs and this practice is discouraged, along with touching or walking on the figures. So keep that in mind. Let's look at some of them. So the presence of canoes, hopefully we can all try to point, whoops, can't do that. Let's get back to here. Okay, so my pointer here, there's a canoe representation. So canoes would date some of the images to what's known as the woodland period, a material culture beginning around 2,500 years ago. The bow and arrow, we see an example over here. They were introduced to the Northeast about 1,500 years ago. So we can use what's in the images to get some sense for when they were constrained, when these might have been made. They mention a house of English form, right? And that would be this here, which looks like a house of English form. And that would suggest a post-contact date. But Roger Ray, who's a former president of the Maine Historical Society, has argued that the petroglyph could also represent the traditional Algonquian dome dwelling and thus could be much older. So we have to kind of sometimes be careful in terms of what assumptions we make about what we see. This figure with a cross, you can see it here. We have looks like a person here, and then we have a cross. That's been interpreted as a Catholic priest, which would also indicate a post-contact date. However, crosses also appear on Ojibwe birchbark song scrolls, like you see on the right. And in that case, they're interpreted as drumsticks for medicine drums. So the presence of crosses at Indian Ledge does not necessarily signal the arrival of Catholicism. Now, between 1977 and 1991, Mark Hedden, an archaeologist employed by the Maine Historic Preservation Commission, identified 107 individual designs at Emden and many more at a series of sites around Machias Bay. Now, using models of prehistoric sea level rise to determine when coastal bedrock would have been cleared of glacial till, he developed a chronology for the area's coastal petroglyphs that spans the last 3,000 years. So basically the idea there is that the seashore would originally have been covered with till. As the water level rose, it would wash the till away, it would make the underlying bedrock available for carving, and that way he could date the various petroglyphs. And using that, he was able to develop this chronology, and then he looked at the style of what he believed were portrayals of shamans, and he then kind of came up with the way the shamanism was, changes in the way shamanism was portrayed over the years. So he identified 6 styles of anthropomorphic representations that represented an evolution in the portrayal of shamanism throughout Maine's woodland period. By comparing these styles to figures carved at Emden, Hedden proposed that the Emden images were created in multiple episodes between AD 900, which was the Middle Ceramic period, and the 1600s, the early contact period. Now, within a shamanic tradition, the images may have served to illustrate cultural narratives. The Kennebec River Valley lies within the traditional territory of the Eastern Abenaki, an Algonquian-speaking people whose oral histories and traditional teachings have survived among the Abenaki who still live in the region. Michael Sokolexis, a Penobscot familiar with the creation stories of the culture hero Gluskabe, studied the Emden petroglyphs, and he found connections with a number of the Gluskabe tales. And this is the good example here. This is a very odd-looking serpent that seems to have a pointed dragon-like tail. And apparently this matches a story describing Gluskabe's combat with a giant snake who had blocked the flow of the river. And he had some help with the aid of a red-headed woodpecker who explained that he had to shoot the snake in the tail. And on a third shot, with the woodpecker helping to guide the arrow, Gluskabe was able to strike the tail of the serpent, breaking its back. So if we think of this image in terms of that story, then the point there on the tail represents Gluskabe's arrowhead, not the tail of a dragon. One of the repeating motifs at Indian Ledge is the thunderbird. Thunderbirds are important figures in Algonquian cosmology, not only responsible for thunder and rain, but also for combating evil forces which lurk underwater. The manner in which thunderbirds are portrayed at Emden is similar to that seen at other Algonquian petroglyph sites as far away as Pennsylvania and Minnesota. So I show some of them here. Now this particular cluster, this is again back at Emden, it's got some thunderbirds, some other shapes we can't quite tell. It's got a what looks like a dog. Question is this a set of independent carvings that might have been done, 100 years apart? Or is it a single scene representing perhaps a story from one of the Gluskabe tales? Well, as we saw in our Spanish horse example, we can often tell from the shape of the dent marks whether a line has been produced by the same hammerstone. So it occurred to me that a close inspection of the dent marks might reveal whether this group of figures could have been produced by the same hammerstone and thus represent a single episode of carving. Now, the problem with testing this hypothesis is that the site sits downstream of a dam, and is often partially and somewhat unpredictably underwater. Now, I'd been lucky when I first visited in 2007, but my research colleague, Walter Van Rogen, was less fortunate when he visited the site in 2015. He got to see an underwater serpent. Now, during the summer of 2022, you may recall, the Northeast was suffering from a prolonged drought. So I thought to myself, this might be our opportunity to examine the peck marks while the images are dry. So Walter and I drove up to Maine to try our luck. Well, on arrival, we were relieved to see that the entire panel was above water, but we were dismayed to find that a number of the petroglyphs were now obscured by a whitish lichen growth. And in many areas, a dark brown biogenic stain also blighted the ledge. This here is the same configuration of thunderbirds which I showed earlier in my 2007 picture. If you look carefully, you can kind of see one of them up there in the corner. So the smooth bluish-gray surface of the bedrock was also marred by thousands of shallow scratch marks, most of which have a light, nearly white hue. And some of these are clearly modern graffiti, initials or simple shapes like hearts, but the vast majority are natural. Bends in the Kennebec River are susceptible to ice jams, accumulations of floating river ice that obstruct the flow of the water and can cause flooding. And small rock grains can be dragged across the ledge by chunks of ice, and that's a likely cause of this profusion of scratches that accompany the petroglyphs. Despite these obstacles, we proceeded to work our way slowly across the ledge from left to right, taking close-up photos of the dent marks as best we could. And at one point, I glanced down to see a configuration of short, incised lines that looked neither natural nor like modern graffiti. The lines were deeper and straighter than most of the natural scratches around it, and they vaguely suggested a canoe paddle. Now, I might have ignored it had we not spent Walter and I had not spent the last few years studying the fine incised rock art at the Pulaski Heritage Site in Sedona, Arizona. Now, incising is yet another way of creating petroglyphs, in this case by cutting into the rock rather than pecking at it. Incisions are deeper than scratches, but the lines can still be very thin, under 1 millimeter wide and deep. And this makes them nearly impossible to see without getting very close and using angled light in order to create shadows. So here's an example of what we saw in Arizona. And in fact, we walked by this a couple of times. Luckily, we caught it in the morning. One time when the sun was shining on it, we realized that there was a panel there. So for 2 years, we had worked with a local photographic team to document a number of these complex abstract panels that the average person would walk right by without even noticing. So, having seen one possible incised figure here on this Indian ledge, we reflexively began to look for other incised lines, even though no such pre-contact art is known to exist in New England. And a few minutes later, we were astonished to see this. So there was little doubt that the faint lines here were intentionally incised. There were pairs of meandering lines, parallel horizontals, cells containing repeating designs. And to make some of my photos a little bit easier to see, I might sometimes include the lines drawn in black. One of the things you can see in this photo, and by the way, this is really small. We're talking a few centimeters wide here. Many of the lines intersect the pecked petroglyphs. Right? You can see, for example, at the bottom, down here, this is part of a pecked petroglyph here, right? So these lines are intersecting the pecked petroglyphs. And what we can see here is that the pecks have basically impacted the incised lines. So this would rule out the incisions being modern graffiti, because they'd actually be now older than the pecked petroglyphs. So at this point, the focus of our visit abruptly changed. Instead of inspecting peck marks, we're now looking to search for incised lines between the peck figures. So we set out a tape measure to capture location information, and we proceeded to take photos at a distance now of just a few centimeters from the surface. And work continued into the night, using rake lighting to help bring out the faint lines. Unfortunately for us, this was mayfly season. And the lighting also brought them out. Well, before long, we were pummeled by mayflies, who were also merciless photobombers. Well, forced to flee by the wildlife, we returned at sunrise to continue our documentation efforts. Well, I focused on the regions with the most definitive imagery, while Walter photographed the entire ledge in order to create a 3D model. And once back home, we laid a half-meter square grid over a snapshot of the model and added markers pinpointing the locations of incised features that we had captured in the detailed photos. Now, as we can see here, much of the surviving incised imagery is clustered within 3 or 4 loci. Fragments of lines elsewhere suggest that much more of the ledge had been utilized, but a good deal of the incised art has been lost due to the dense covering of petroglyphs. Distinguishing intentional incisions from natural scratches and modern graffiti is particularly difficult in areas where little of the original surface remains because of all the petroglyphs. So the panel is kind of like a jigsaw puzzle with most of the pieces missing. But despite the loss of so much of the art, several repeating motifs did catch our attention. The most ubiquitous of these were what we would see as paired parallel lines. And here are some examples. Sometimes, as you can see, they're decorated, right? You've got some decorations here within the lines, over here as well. I mean, even though these are tiny, you can see a lot of care was taken. And here you see how they make the 2 lines. Then we've got a set of wider lines here, then narrower down here again. So a lot of subtlety here. You know, we're talking tiny little areas. Yeah, sometimes they form arcs or fans. And like we said, the interiors of some lines are decorated, such as where this mayfly is pointing over here on the right. In addition to these paired lines, we often found long flowing groups of 3 or more lines. And I'll give you a darkened version of it here, but this is what it would look like more naturally. So here it is with darkened. So as we can see in these examples, the line groups periodically swell and contract. And we saw this happening enough to suspect that it was an intentional feature, not just an accident. We saw circles. We identified 4 instances of small circular designs. One is simply an outlined circle. Others are composed of multiple overlapping curved lines, which give the appearance of forming a circle. And the most striking is this one, a round figure just 2.5 centimeters wide, which appears to have fringe around it and serves as the terminus of a pair of parallel lines. So again, you see the scale up there. This is like, you know, the size of a quarter maybe. It's pretty small. We also encountered a handful of unique designs. So here is this long decorated ovoid. Here are some rectilinear features. And then here's some more rectilinear ones, including the original paddle that started the whole thing off. And then there were these handful of these more complex composite figures that also shared features which suggest that they may be thematically related to each other. So each one is topped by this kind of downward facing arch. I've got the, you look at the top here, right? So you've got this arch on the top. And then below, we have some horizontal lines. And we see this several times, 3 examples with varying complexity. So here Here's another case. Again, if we look at it, we've got sort of these almost two arches, right? But basically forming kind of an overarching top area. And then down at the bottom, we get more of these kind of horizontals. These are a little more chaotic down in this particular example. And then here's the third example. This is the most complex figure that we saw. It was the one that kind of initially convinced us that this was intentional rock art. It's a pretty complex figure, but again, it's got an arch on the top and then it's got some horizontals below. And here we can kind of make that out by these close-ups. A lot of times it's very hard to look at this in big pictures. You have to kind of focus in on small areas. So hopefully you can see, barely make out the line here across the top. Okay, so that arch is all the way across. You can see it here coming down. And this is a close-up of this small area at the top right here. So again, it's very finely done, a lot of detail going on here. And then down below, where in the other images, remember we saw some horizontals down below the arch. That's what we get down here. We get these sort of bands across with, again, what looks like some internal decoration. Now, it should be clear by now that documenting art at this small a scale presents a number of difficulties. Without extreme magnification, details in photos are nearly impossible to see. And large sections of the panel have been obliterated by petroglyphs. So on the surviving surfaces, the incisions are virtually, visually competing with natural scratches, rock bedding lines, and modern graffiti. So photos are, not the best documentation for this. So we ended up enlisting the aid of Melanie Mayhew, who was a rock art illustrator from Pennsylvania who had experience using Photoshop to overcome some of these issues. So using Photoshop layers, she could then use a stylus to draw over the photographs while zooming in and out. She also used Photoshop layers to separate the pecked from the incised figures. And then additional layers could be used to add interpolated lines, as well as to highlight specific features to help visualize the big picture. So here are some examples of this approach. So here's an example of a large region that's about a meter by a meter and a half altogether. So first we have a layer that just outlines the pecked petroglyphs. Okay, then we add a layer that contains a lot of the incised petroglyphs. It's already getting pretty complicated and messy. Then we could try subtracting the outlines of the pecked petroglyphs and see what's left. And then in order to help visualize it holistically, we can kind of sort of fill in some of the gaps, leave some things out, and try to get a picture of what's going on, sort of the big picture, even though, this is really what we've got there. And again, we can only fill out so much because there's so much that's been, pecked over or eroded that we really only want to fill in parts where it's pretty obvious this is how a line would be continued. So here's another example. This is a smaller region within that larger region, which is about 35 centimeters by 48 centimeters. So again, here's the outline of the petroglyphs. Here are the incised lines. Now we remove the outlines of the petroglyphs. We can do some interpolation in red just to try to fill in some of the lines that we believe would have been there if they weren't pecked away. We can then remove, the background altogether. And here's a close-up again of, what some of the lines are. So pretty tough to kind of make out what's going on here because there's so many other things interfering with it. But at least this gives us a little bit of a fighting chance in terms of using this technology. Otherwise, we'd have to deal with this, right? This is what we're looking at. And you can see why it may have gone undetected, even though this site, a lot of people have been looking at this site over the years. In fact, we sometimes find one of these figures, and then we go somewhere else. We come back, we can't find it again, even though we know it's there. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about trying to contextualize what we're seeing here, right? What other information might we be able to add beyond just the descriptive stuff? So earlier in this talk, I discussed contextualizing the pecked art at Indian Ledge. We used Mark Hedden's stylistic comparisons with figures at Machias Bay for dating, and we used analogs in Algonquian creation stories as a possible explanation for some of the images. So let's look at dating and interpretation for this incised art. So regarding dating, Mark Hedden had noted that the first appearance of rock art in Maine around 3,000 years ago coincided with other changes in the material culture, including the introduction of fired clay pottery. Now, the movement of Algonquian language groups eastward from the Great Lakes region around this time could account for some of these adaptations and explain similarities in rock art across historical Algonquian-speaking territories, from the Great Lakes all the way to the Atlantic coast. And most of the petroglyphs at Algonquian sites are naturalistic representations of anthropomorphs and zoomorphs formed by pecking. Sites containing incised motifs are relatively rare in the Northeast, and they tend to contain motifs that place much of the art firmly within the proto-historic time frame, although some instances may be older. There is little similarity in style or content with the Emden figures. It is primarily on portable items, such as pendants and stone tablets, that we find this more kind of abstract or geometric kind of design that contain these paired or multi-line motifs that are more reminiscent of the Emden designs. And dates for these items found in context indicate that abstract incised art in the Northeast spanned all cultural periods. Among instances dated to the Archaic period, which would go from roughly maybe 8,000 years ago to around 3,000 years ago, tended to be more abstract, geometric, whereas art dated to the ceramic period from around 2,500 years ago through contact shows a greater mix of figurative and non-figurative motifs. So based on the available circumstantial evidence, including the presence of a substantial archaic occupation site just across the river, we hypothesize that the incised art on Emden's Indian Ledge was created during the Archaic period, prior to the changes in material culture associated with Maine's cooling climate around 3,600 years ago. And so this might explain also why the entire thing might have been pecked over again by a later culture, or maybe it was no longer visible, 1,000 years later, and was picked over again. Well, what might it mean? Okay, interpretation. All right, interpreting rock art in the absence of ethnographic information from the culture that produced it is necessarily speculative. There may be thousands of years separating incised art from even contact period ethnography. However, as religion is often generally conserved, we are going to cautiously draw some inspiration from the ethnographies of tribes from the Great Lakes to the coast of Maine. So we'll focus on those three composite designs, right? Those complex designs with the arches on top and the more horizontals below it, and try to see if we can come up with some ideas based on those. And let's start with this one. So the decorative motifs on the arched image with the greatest detail for us were evocative of designs woven into historic Abenaki baskets. In fact, we would refer to this design as we were documenting it as the basket. For the Abenaki, baskets are much more than utilitarian items. They're made from wooden strips painstakingly teased apart from black ash trees. They are literally kin to the Abenaki themselves, since Gluskabe created humans from the very same tree. The overall contour of the composite figures, with a rounded arch above and horizontal layers below, resembles a basket with a rounded handle. However, we have to be careful here. Because there are so few examples of pre-contact basketry, it's not clear whether a round handle would have been a common feature of baskets prior to the influence of post-contact commercial interests. So a more compelling analog for the dome shape of the composite figures may be the traditional lodge design. Whether intended for a single medicine man or a group, a wigwam, a shaking tent, or a sweat lodge was typically constructed by creating a frame out of bent saplings and then covering it with hides or bark. So this photograph in the bottom right of a Chippewa shaman standing beside the frame of his personal shaking tent presents a plausible match for the dome figure on the left. Shaking tent rites, as well as steam rituals involving repetitive chanting and drumming in a sweat lodge, were intended to induce altered states of consciousness, which could include the feeling of traveling to upper and lower worlds. Now, the Algonquian cosmos is layered into these distinct worlds, worlds inhabited by powerful spirits known as manitous. The upper realms of the sky and the earth are home to good manitous, while bad manitous dwell in the lower realms, underwater and underground. And these distinct worlds are connected via whirlpools, caves, and crevices. Thresholds between worlds are associated with chains in the landscape, such as where land meets sea, earth meets rock, forest meets open space. So individuals who had formed the most powerful relationships with the manitous, which would be known as shamans or powwows, could enter into the upper spirit world or into the underwater realms associated with dangerous or uncontrollable or uncontainable powers. And lodges and longhouses were also built in accordance with their place in the cosmos, and they were designed to represent symbolic thresholds between worlds. So this suggests yet another interpretation of the arched top designs, that they capture a shaman's visions of travel through these respective realms. The upper arch may represent the sky, just as it does in mnemonic Ojibwe song scrolls. Below the arch, the orderly decorated horizontal bands in the rock art may represent cosmological layers within sky or earth. And then beneath those, the chaotic maze of disorderly, I don't know if this is showing up here. I guess it isn't, okay. So below the arch, the orderly decorated horizontal band, okay. Oh, the long disorderly lines that tend to be at the bottom of these things might portray the dangerous underworld. And then we've got these long flowing lines from the sky to the underworld. They might suggest water in its various roles. Now, this interpretation has the advantage of accounting for many of the motifs that we have seen on the ledge, and also provide a motivation for the figures, which is consistent with the widely held belief that much Northeast rock art is associated with shamanic visions. Indian Ledge itself, located at the junction of sky, earth, water, and underground, must have been considered a place of powerful Manitou. Whether or not any of these interpretations is accurate, it is worth noting that alternative explanations of Native American rock art need not be mutually exclusive. Algonquian languages are highly metaphorical, and Canadian rock art researcher Grace Rainovich writes, "The language gives us clues to the interpretation of signs on the rock paintings. They don't mean one thing, but several. And the observer must, like the poetry critic, have all the possibilities in mind when drawing conclusions about their meaning." So whatever conclusions we draw about their meaning, the presence of incised art at Indian Ledge adds a tantalizing, holds a tantalizing new dimension to the material culture of the prehistoric occupants of the Kennebec Valley. Hopefully, knowledge of its presence at Emden will lead to further targeted exploration, and with any luck, new discoveries for us to ponder. Thanks. So, yeah, if anybody has any comments or questions.
There's at least one in the chat, and it's from Libby Levinson. What tools might have been used to etch such fine lines?
Oh, okay. So, if in a typical lithic toolkit, you would have various very sharp tools, typically made out of chert or flint, potentially obsidian, which would allow you to make cuts into skins, for example. And these could also make cuts into this fine-grained rock like this. We didn't try it, but we know from other experience that you can make incisions in certain kinds of rock. The rock has to be pretty fine-grained in order to work. If you try to use in granite, you're just going to get kind of a scratch. It's just going to crumple up. So that may be why we don't see a whole lot of this. But where we do find, this kind of metamorphized shale kind of rock, that may be a good place to look. Yes.
You have to get permission to do all of your research, and you have to let the state of Maine know what you found.
So, okay, so the question was, for this kind of research, do you need to get permission? So Maine has this kind of right of way that if the land is not marked, for no trespassing, that people can go on. So basically, there is an area nearby here, which is an archaeological site, which you're not allowed to disturb. And we're very careful here. Obviously, this would be an Indian sacred site, clearly, so we have to be very careful with it. But in general, unless it's marked, we in theory have permission to do it.
Did you have to tell anybody what you found?
Well, we're telling people now, and we've written it up as well. It's going to appear in the American Indian Rock Art Journal, which is put out by the American Rock Art Research Association. Yes.
Is there any indication that arches could also represent something as simple as a rain?
That's another possible interpretation, right? Like I say, when we get into interpretation, we're speculating. So you could say, okay, rainbows, how does that fit in with any known ethnography? How would it fit in with the other kinds of things that show up in there? It's not, I wouldn't rule it out, but you'd want to try to see how it would work. Yes.
I had found other instances of precise lines in other
Well, in Arizona, we found many of them. Yes. And actually in Spain, where it was just crawling around in caves, there was plenty of them to be found there as well. We are looking around in New England for other examples. Similar to this, we haven't found any yet. Like I say, they do show up on portable art. So, maybe Pine Hawk, did Pine Hawk come up with any portable art in their excavation? Yes, that would be another place to look. And I'd love to see more examples of incised portable art to try to compare to what we're seeing here and see if we could hone in on maybe a more likely date or culture for it.
Don't forget to repeat the question.
Sorry about that. So the question was, do we know of any other examples of this kind of fine-lined art here in New England? I should say that in Canada, Kejimkujik, there is a large area around the lake there. I haven't been to it myself, but it does have incised art that's relatively on the same scale. But most of that is proto-historic. You find things like ships portrayed there, a lot of costumes, so it's probably, relatively recent, although some could be older. That's probably the best example. There's another example up in Maine, which again is datable as historic and was probably made by metal tools. Yes.
I went on a field trip to the site
Okay, so the question was, we went on a field trip and saw some handprints that were carved into rocks in Middleborough, and they're actually different methods for producing those. So some were produced by pecking them out. Remember the one on the one on top of the hill, right? That was completely pecked out pretty much and embedded into the stone. We saw some other ones where the outline was carved, right? So you could see the outline of the finger. So it's, and that one would have probably been made by a metal tool and, you know, scraped in that way. So that would be incised probably by a metal tool. So yeah, multiple ways of making them. And that's a whole nother story, the handprints around here in New England. I've written a paper on that too. But that's a whole other story in itself.
There was a question online. What are some theories for why the petroglyphs be made over existing sized line glyphs? Why not unused rocks?
Okay, so it's always a good question. And in fact, that's one of the things that we look at in rock art is called superposition, right? So where you do have one form of rock art over another. And we use that in order to try to figure out which came first. So sometimes you might see, in fact, out in Arizona, we studied these things for a long time. We had many cultures working on the same walls. We found very fine incised lines. And then we found some deeper grooves. And then we found paint. And we had to, you know, look microscopically pretty much at this stuff to try to figure out which came first. But we more or less had things all layered on top of each other. So now the question is, why might that be the case? And there is a whole range of possibilities, right? One might be it was deliberate, right? That you're trying to take away the power of whatever it was that was underneath there and replace it by whatever power you're putting up there. Another might be that the earlier stuff has now faded. It's no longer, it's done its job, right? It's no longer being, you can't really see it very well. Perhaps it wasn't even meant to be seen for a long time, right? Maybe the important thing is doing it in the first place. And the fact that, you know, it lasted 100 years or 1,000 years wasn't really that important. You know, so there are different reasons. In this particular case, you know, as you can see, the incised art, it probably would have been visible when it was first cut, right? Because even very thin marks, when they're first made, are going to show a color difference between the surface and the interior. And then over time, you know, water flowing over it and erosion and such, it might have been almost invisible. And now you've got this beautiful spot along the river, particularly a place where you would actually might, you know, your canoe might come there, and that might be where you would ford your canoe because there's a waterfall just upstream from here. So you could reuse the surface, right? It's like reusing a blackboard. And if it's the case that they wanted to use that to tell stories, right? To have these creation stories, maybe someone decided it was worth repurposing for that. So again, we don't really know for sure. There are a lot of possible reasons why this same area might be reused. Right? Probably an area of power, for sure. So that alone could be a reason.
Peter, do you know if
anyone else or yourselves?
As far as we could tell, the used area was all well above the waterline we were there. In fact, that allowed us to kind of work our way along the side without having to step on, you know, on the things while we were studying them. So our impression was that there weren't other carvings down sort of below where the river currently is. Now, rivers change course, they change levels. If this was archaic, it might have been during a dry, the archaic was a drier, warmer, drier, warmer period than the later woodland period. So the whole landscape may have been different then. Maybe this was higher up. The river might not have been so high at that point. And in fact, part of the ledge was blown away by loggers because it jutted out into the river and was interfering with getting log jams. So they blew away the end of it. And as far as we can tell, the petroglyphs stopped before the part that got blown away, but we don't really know for sure. Yes.
You answered a lot of this already. Maybe more context about the topology there, because it's very interesting. Well, is this the most prominent point for a good part of the river there?
Yes, this is at a bend in the river. Oh, sorry. Yes, I always forget. So the question was, can we talk a little bit more about the landscape in that particular spot? So this was a prominent spot, and in fact, on one side here there was a woodland archaeological site, and on the other side of the river there was occupation sites that date back probably as old as 6,000 years. There was a hiatus around 3,000 years after some flooding was there, and then the area was reused again. So this was a spot that was inhabited for most of the time, probably since the glaciers receded. And again, it was at a bend in the river. This would have been a great place, to catch fish. Right, you have a waterfall just upstream just a little bit. So maybe you'd bring your dugout canoes. If you're in the archaic, you bring your dugout canoes up to here. You wouldn't be able to get much further. If you were in the woodland period with birch bark canoes, this might be where you take your canoe out and start portaging. So yeah, a very important spot for lots of reasons, both practical reasons and potentially spiritual reasons.
Look at testimony with question. You had a wonderful map of the Algonquin speaking tribes, and we have a lot of New England, big chunk of New England, and a great chunk around the Midwest. When I visited one Indian reservation in the upper Midwest, like top of Minnesota, they had a history that 500 years before that they had come from New England, from the east, and settled that area. Do you know, and do they have the same traditions, or is it that help us fill in some of the gaps in that history?
Okay. So the question is, we know that there are Algonquian-speaking groups, at least during contact period, that ranged all the way from the Great Lakes to the Atlantic coast. There's even a pocket or two out in California. So clearly people traveled a lot. And as far as when they did that traveling, were there migrations? Were the same people here for 12,000 years? Or did people move around? There's a lot of debate. And without sort of genetic studies like they're doing in Europe, where you can actually look at ancient genomes, it's pretty hard to tell just from cultural remains whether they're there because people moved or whether because they were influenced by somebody else. Chances are there was a lot of movement. I think the questioner was asking about some movement from the Atlantic into the Great Lakes, and that is part of the oral history of the Ojibwa. That they, or the Chippewa is another way to say the name. So they talk about having migrated probably, in the few hundred years prior to contact. And around the same time, the Iroquois were kind of moving down, and they were always engaged in warfare with the Algonquin-speaking groups. So there was probably a lot of this kind of movement back and forth over the last 12,000 years. It's just we know there's contact. We can find similarities in terms of things like rock art and other pieces of material culture. But in terms of exactly, when people moved and such, it's pretty hard to recreate. It's great. It's a great question. And there's a lot of papers out there. I'm sure if you look for them, you'd find that there's the Susquehanna tradition, there's the Moorhead tradition. There's a number of, material cultures that differ in various ways that people have tried to explain, over time using migrations.
There's a couple more questions from the web. Catherine asks, have you used D-Stretch or other imaging software on the images?
Okay, so the question was, have we used D-Stretch or other imaging software on the images? And for people who don't know, D-Stretch is a tool that you can, it's software that you can apply to photographs to bring out certain colors. And it's very useful since it deals with colors for dealing with pictographs, right? Dealing with painting. In fact, I used it extensively when I was in Spain to pull out paintings on cave walls that were almost invisible, but you use the software and you can see, oh, there's a horse, there's a bull. For the use with petroglyphs, it's less useful, again, because petroglyphs, there's sometimes some color differences, but not necessarily the ones that the software is designed to enhance. Strangely enough, we did use a biotechnology, in a sense, for our study here, and that is that same kind of black biogenic material that was kind of interfering with some of the ledge. It might be an algae, it might be a cyanobacteria, we don't really know. Apparently, the incisions for the rock art were deep enough that it became like a habitat for this stuff, whereas the scratches weren't really. So one of the clues that we used for identifying, purposefully incised marks was the fact that it had this black biomaterial inside of it. So we had a kind of a non-technical color approach in this particular case. Yes.
There's another one that came in on the chat. Did colonials destroy native art because of their poor opinion of natives, as was done in the mounds? My town's river has farm stone to indicate a safe crossing point to the other side of the rapid. My town has covered up evidence of native sites.
Yeah, okay, right back and find out where that petroglyph is. I do want to know. By the way, for people watching, I have been trying to kind of keep a collection of all the petroglyphs in New England on file so that we know what their state is, what their status is, get some good recent documentation of it. Another archaeologist, Ed Anick, had been doing this for New England petroglyphs since probably the 60s or 70s. He's getting old now, doesn't get around as much, although he's still writing books, and they're great books. So look for Edward Lennox's books on petroglyphs if you're interested. But I'm kind of following literally in his footsteps now and trying to keep track of both the existing rock art that we're familiar with, and if anybody finds any new, let me know. I'll try to record it and make sure we have documentation on it. So the question was, yeah, do people destroy these kinds of things? Certainly early on, there are records of, the Puritans and stuff destroying things they consider idols or works of the devil. But I don't know that they actually destroyed any of this rock art. And in fact, like Dighton Rock, the Tiverton rocks, a lot of those were actually studied by clerics, and such, who were the intellectuals of the time, and they were actually very interested in it. So they weren't necessarily destroying it; they were studying it and documenting it. The biggest problem with rock art in New England has been that much of it is along rivers, and rivers get dammed, and once they get dammed, they're now underwater. So we've probably lost a lot of New England rock art simply inadvertently through damming.
I go over the town.
Okay, if you asked that question, make sure you said that where that is so we can add that to our inventory if we don't have it. Any other questions? Yes.
There are other authors that want to remove dams. People going out the areas where dams happen.
That's an interesting thought. I mean, I think in that case, I'd be interested in knowing. Oh, okay. I always forget to repeat the question. Yeah. So the question was, we're now starting to see removal of some dams, in which case maybe some petroglyphs might be re-exposed. So have I been looking at those? I have not. It would be interesting, because sometimes there are reports of petroglyphs that have been lost due to dams, and those would be the ones you'd want to try tracking down. One of the big problems is you don't necessarily just expose the petroglyphs once you remove the dam, right? They could now be buried under lots of sediment. So they might still be difficult to find. And in fact, there's a woman, I forget her name, she does scuba diving, and she has been searching for many years. And I believe she has located some of the panels that had been buried up near Brattleboro, Vermont. But again, she had to remove a lot of sediment in order to find them. And I think before she could get good documentation, the sediment was back on them. So I don't know that we've got good documentation of those yet. That's something that would be worth following up on. Well, thank you. These have all been great questions. It's a pleasure to be back discussing rock art with everybody. Thank you for all your questions online, and we'll bid you adieu.
Thank you. No, I still have not answered.